The wind had teeth in this town, a bitter thing that gnawed through the thin fabric of Alara's shawl and scraped grit against her chapped skin. It was a place that felt forgotten by God, a collection of sun-bleached timber and hardened gazes huddled under an unforgiving sky. Dust was the currency here, coating every surface, filling every lung, and promising nothing but a slow, gritty decline. In Alara's arms, the small bundle that was her son, Leo, gave a weak, mewling cry. It was a sound that tore through her more viciously than the wind. His hunger was a hollow echo of her own, a constant, aching void that had consumed her hope and was now threatening to consume her child. She stood before the mercantile, its windows clouded with grime, the painted letters of its sign flaking away like sunburnt skin. Inside was food, flour, beans, salted meat. Survival. But survival had a price, and she had nothing left. Nothing but the one object she had sworn she would never part with. Her fingers, numb with cold and fear, tightened on the small, folded square of wool tucked inside her shawl. It was soft, worn from love and use, its pale blue yarn interwoven with tiny, stitched white stars. Her grandmother had made it the day Alara was born, and Alara had wrapped Leo in it the moment he had drawn his first breath. It was the only tangible piece of legacy she had to give him, a fragile link to a past where love existed, where bellies were full and the future was a promise, not a threat. Taking a shuddering breath that tasted of dust and despair, she pushed open the heavy door. A bell jangled with startling aggression. The air inside was thick with the scent of dried goods, leather, and the sour smell of the man behind the counter. He was a squat, balding man named Abernathy, his eyes small and shrewd, missing nothing. He had watched her for 2 days as she haunted the edges of the town, a wraith with a silent baby, and his expression held no pity, only a cold, mercantile calculation. "Well?" he grunted, not bothering to look up from the ledger he was scratching in. Alara's voice was a dry whisper, lost in the cavernous silence of the store. She cleared her throat and tried again. I have something to sell." Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the blanket and laid it on the rough-hewn counter. The soft blue was a slash of impossible color against the drab brown wood. It seemed to hold a light of its own, a memory of gentler hands and kinder days. Abernathy finally looked at it, his lip curling. He poked it with a grimy finger. "Wool," he stated, his tone dismissive. "Worn. What am I to do with a baby's blanket?" "It's finely made," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "The yarn is strong. It's warm." The desperation was a raw, physical thing in her throat. She could feel the stares of the few other patrons in the store, their judgment clinging to her like burrs. A woman alone, a baby, no husband in sight. They had already written her story, and it was a sordid one. Abernathy scoffed. "I'll give you 2 bits. For the wool. 2 bits. It was an insult. It was starvation deferred by a single day, perhaps 2. It was the price of her last shred of dignity, the valuation of her only heirloom. Tears pricked the back of her eyes, hot and shameful. "Please," she whispered. "It's worth more. My son, he needs milk. Food." The storekeeper leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial sneer. "The world is full of needs, girl. Not my concern how you meet them." A shadow fell over the counter. Alara hadn't heard anyone approach. A man stood beside her, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence seeming to suck the air from the room. He wore a dusty duster, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, shadowing a face that was all harsh angles and sun-weathered stillness. He looked as if he'd been carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. He was the man she had seen watching from the saloon porch earlier, his gaze unervingly steady. He reached out a gloved hand and gently pushed the blanket back toward her. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together, yet it held a quiet authority that silenced the room. "Keep it." He turned his gaze to Abernathy, and for the first time, Alara saw the storekeeper flinch. "I'll get you food," the stranger said. His words directed at her, but his eyes still locked on the man behind the counter. He never looked at her, not directly. He simply began to point. Flour, a sack of beans, lard, salt pork, coffee, and a can of that condensed milk. Abernathy hesitated, his greedy eyes darting between the stranger and Alara. But there was something in the man's posture, a coiled stillness that promised swift and unpleasant consequences, that made the storekeeper move. He began to gather the items, his movements sullen and jerky. The stranger laid a few heavy coins on the counter, the sound a final, definitive thud in the tense silence. He gathered the sacks into his arms with an ease that spoke of immense strength. He gave Alara a slight, almost imperceptible nod toward the door. It was not a request. It was a direction. Clutching the precious blanket to her chest, with Leo blessedly quiet against her, she followed him out into the biting wind, leaving the suffocating judgment of the town behind her. She did not know his name or what he wanted, only that for the first time in weeks, the crushing weight of tomorrow had, for a moment, been lifted. His name was Silas. He offered it not as an introduction but as a simple fact, stated while he led her away from the main street and toward the desolate edge of the settlement. He walked a pace ahead, his long strides forcing her to hurry to keep up. He did not speak again. The silence was a vast, empty space between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind and the soft thud of his boots on the hard-packed earth. Alara's mind raced, a frantic catalogue of fear and suspicion. No one did anything for nothing. Charity was a myth, a story told to children. Men like this, quiet and hard-edged, took what they wanted. She clutched Leo tighter, her knuckles white, every muscle in her body tensed for a fight she knew she could not win. He led her to a small, derelict cabin that stood isolated from the town, leaning as if tired of its long battle with the elements. It looked abandoned, a place of last resort. Her heart sank. This was it, the price. He would corner her in this ruin, and no one would hear her scream over the wind. But Silas did not follow her to the door. He stopped a few feet away, setting the heavy sacks down on the rickety porch. "It's dry inside," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The well is out back. It's clean." He turned his head slightly, and his eyes met hers for a fleeting second. They were the color of slate, holding a depth of sorrow that startled her. "Town's no place for you and the boy." And then he was gone. He simply turned and walked away, his form shrinking against the immense, pale landscape until he vanished. Alara stood frozen on the porch, the sacks of food at her feet feeling both like an anchor and a lifeline. She listened until the sound of his footsteps was completely swallowed by the wind. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed open the cabin door. He was right. It was dry. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from a grimy window, but the roof seemed solid. There was a stone hearth, a simple cot frame, a rough table. It was empty, but it was shelter. The first days were a blur of tentative survival. She found a bucket and drew water from the well. She swept the floor with a branch, clearing away the neglect of seasons. With the flour and lard, she made flatbread, the smell filling the small space with a scent so wholesome it made her weep. She warmed the condensed milk with water and watched, her heart in her throat, as Leo drank greedily, his small body finally receiving the nourishment it craved. For the first time in months, he slept with a full belly, his breathing deep and even. Watching him, Alara felt a flicker of something she had thought long dead. A fragile, cautious hope. She remained wary of Silas. He was a ghost in her new life. She would catch glimpses of him on the ridge line, a silent sentinel on horseback, watching the cabin from a distance. He never approached when she was outside. His help came in unspoken offerings. One morning, she opened the door to find a neat stack of firewood beside the porch. Another day, 2 rabbits, cleaned and dressed, hung from a nail by the door. He never waited for thanks. He provided and disappeared, a force of nature as quiet and inexorable as the turning of the seasons. Her suspicion began to slowly, almost imperceptibly, melt away, eroded by his consistency. He asked for nothing. He took nothing. His protection was a silent, unobtrusive shield. She began to see not a threat in his distant observations, but a watchfulness. The men from town gave the cabin a wide berth. She knew it was because of him. He had a reputation she'd gathered from snippets of conversation she'd overheard. He was a man who had seen too much, done too much, and now sought only solitude. Why he had extended his solitude to include her and Leo, she did not understand. One afternoon, mending a tear in his discarded flannel shirt she'd found near the woodpile, she noticed it was the same pale blue as Leo's blanket. The thought was so unexpected it made her stop, the needle poised in her hand. She looked from the worn fabric of the shirt to the soft wool of the blanket draped over her sleeping son. It was just a color, of course. Coincidence. But in the quiet loneliness of the cabin, it felt like a thread of connection. An unspoken piece of a story she could not yet read. She finished her meticulous repair, folded the shirt neatly, and left it on the porch rail where he would find it. It was her first offering, her first word in their silent conversation. The next morning it was gone. In its place was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its wings poised for flight. The fragile piece was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. It was a different sound from Silas's lone, steady passage. This was the clumsy, arrogant beat of multiple hooves, too loud, too close. Alara's blood ran cold. She peered through a crack in the shutters and saw them. Abernathy, the storekeeper, and two other men from the town she recognized by their sneering faces. They rode with a possessive swagger, as if they owned the very land they trespassed upon. Fear, sharp and metallic, flooded her mouth. She backed away from the window, her hand instinctively going to Leo, who slept in his cradle. On the wall, above the hearth, hung the rifle. Silas had left it there on the third day, along with a small box of cartridges. "Just in case," he'd said, his back already turned to her as he walked away. At the time, the sight of it had terrified her. Now her hand closed around its cool wooden stock. Her father had taught her to shoot, long ago in another life. The memory, once painful, was now a source of strength. Her hands were shaking, but her purpose was clear. This small, dusty cabin had become their sanctuary. She would not let them defile it. She unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch, the heavy rifle held across her body. The movement was deliberate, calm. The woman who had trembled before Abernathy in the store was gone. In her place stood a mother protecting her child, a survivor who had been shown a sliver of kindness and would defend it with her life. Abernathy pulled his horse to a halt, a look of surprise warring with contempt on his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his eyes raking over her. "Look what the cat dragged in. Got yourself a protector, have you? We don't take kindly to his sort around here. Or yours." "This is my home," Alara said, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the terror that beat against her ribs. "You are not welcome here. Leave." One of the other men laughed, a coarse, ugly sound. "His home," she says. "This is Thornland, and Silas is just squatting. Same as you." He started to dismount, a leering grin spreading across his face. "We're just here to collect the rent." "Stay where you are," Alara warned, raising the rifle. The barrel was heavy, but she held it firm, aiming it at the center of the man's chest. The grin on his face faltered. Abernathy's eyes narrowed into vindictive slits. "You wouldn't dare. A lone woman like you," he urged his horse forward a step. "Put that thing down before you hurt someone." It was a standoff, the vast, silent plains bearing witness. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she did not blink. She held their glares, her own resolve hardening into something unbreakable. But she was one woman against three men. It was a fight she could not win, and the knowledge was a cold stone in her gut. Just as the man on the ground took another step, a voice cut through the tension, as quiet and deadly as a snake in the dust. "She told you to leave." Silas was there. He had materialized from the landscape as if summoned by her desperation. his horse standing motionless on the low rise behind the cabin. He hadn't been watching from a distance, he had been close. Always close. He held no weapon in his hands, yet his presence was more menacing than any firearm. His face was unreadable, carved from shadow and stone, but his eyes were fixed on Abernathy, and they burned with a cold, controlled fire. The storekeeper's bluster evaporated. He visibly paled, his grip tightening on his reins. The other men froze, their bravado vanishing in the face of the silent, formidable man on the ridge. Silas's reputation was a palpable thing, a story written in the fear of lesser men. He slowly dismounted, his movements economical and deliberate. Every step he took toward them was heavy with unspoken threat. He stopped beside Alara on the porch, a solid wall of strength at her side. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the heat of his presence, a steadying force. "This land," Silas said, his voice dangerously soft, "and this woman are under my protection. There is nothing for you here. Not now. Not ever. Turn your horses around." It was not a suggestion. It was a command backed by the absolute certainty of violence. Abernathy swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his fleshy neck. He looked from Silas's face to the rifle still held steady in Alara's hands, and he saw a united front he had not anticipated. He saw not a victim and her keeper, but two resolute people who would not be moved. Without another word, he wrenched his horse's head around and spurred it back toward the distant, hazy smudge of the town. His companions scrambled to follow, casting frightened looks over their shoulders. They rode away in a cloud of dust and cowardice, their retreat hurried and undignified. The silence they left behind was profound. The wind sighed through the sparse grass, and the world seemed to settle back into its natural rhythm. Alara slowly lowered the rifle, her arms aching with the strain. The adrenaline receded, leaving her trembling, but it was a tremor of aftermath, not fear. Silas turned to her. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then at her face. A flicker of something, respect, approval, passed through his slate-gray eyes. "You did well," he said. The simple words landed in her soul like rain on parched earth. It was an acknowledgment not of his rescue, but of her own strength. He had not saved a helpless woman. He had stood with a woman who was already fighting her own battle. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She gestured with her head toward the cabin door. "The fire is lit. There's coffee." It was more than an offer of hospitality. It was an invitation into her world, the first she had ever truly extended to him. He hesitated for only a moment before giving a slow, deliberate nod. Inside, the cabin was warm and filled with the scent of wood smoke and the faint, sweet smell of her sleeping child. Leo stirred in his cradle, nestled under the soft blue blanket with its stitched white stars. Alara saw Silas's gaze linger on it for a moment, a deep, unreadable emotion shadowing his features before it was gone. He took the cup of coffee she offered, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. It was the first time they had ever touched. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. He sat at the rough table, she took the chair opposite, and they drank in a comfortable silence. The barrier of suspicion and necessity had dissolved, replaced by a quiet, unspoken understanding. They were two solitary souls who had found an unlikely harbor in one another. She was no longer just a recipient of his charity, and he was no longer just her mysterious protector. They were partners, forged in the crucible of hardship and cemented in a moment of shared defiance. Outside, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the vast sky in hues of rose and gold. For the first time, Alara looked out at the unforgiving landscape not with fear, but with a burgeoning sense of belonging. The world was still a harsh and difficult place, but she was no longer facing it alone. The blanket, once a symbol of all she had lost, was now a testament to all she had found. It was not an heirloom of the past, but the first thread in the tapestry of a new life.